everyone, you're watching Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch and I'm Pragya. On today's show, we discuss big news from the United States, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank revealing the hollowness of its much touted venture capital ecosystem. Next up, we discuss the lasting memories and continuing legacy of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela's former president. And for our final segment today, we discuss implications of the United States and South Korea's ongoing military drills. The collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in the United States has spelled trouble for its venture capital ecosystem, supposedly the pride and joy of California's tech sector. Signature Bank and Silvergate, with significant exposures to cryptocurrencies, have also collapsed. The US government has assured decisive action and that depositors will get their money back. Tech expert Bapaditya Sinha joins us with more on the significance. Reports which say that there was a high level of cryptocurrency exposure of one of these banks and that one of them is actually an exchange of cryptocurrency. Is there a connection here?
Yeah. So the other two banks, Silvergate and Signature Bank, they had high cryptocurrency exposure. Silicon Valley Bank itself is really highly exposed to the tech scene. However, one of the cryptocurrencies, there is a cryptocurrency called there is a stable coin which is called USDC. That's a stable coin from a company called Circle, which is the second biggest stable coin that is currently available in the market, and $3.3 billion of their assets were parked with the Silicon Valley Bank, and so that cryptocurrency depegged from the whole idea is that that the idea of stable coin is that it's pegged to the dollar, right? So they kind of guarantee you that you can exchange one of them with US dollar, but that it depegged because of this exposure to Silicon Valley Bank. But the real story of Silicon Valley Bank is not so much about cryptocurrency, but it's about the exposure to tech, and that's where it's interesting on why this bank went down. This is not really like the 2008 financial crisis when we saw that the entire US financial sector got rattled because of these high risk mortgages, right, that they had done and then packaged and repackaged, and everybody was connected. This bank was not doing any of that. Actually, what they were doing was fairly boring. They were taking the deposits and then they were putting them in, they're investing them in US treasuries, supposedly the most secure things you can put your money in, and in mortgage-backed securities, but not like not low-grade mortgages. They were putting it in Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, right? The big things which are practically backed by the US government. So that's what they were doing. Things which appear on the face of it to be regular boring stuff, but they still went down. And the reason they went down was that in the last 1 year, the US Federal Reserve has raised their the Fed's fund rate, right? That's the basic rate. They have tightened their monetary policy and they've increased the Fed fund rate from 0%, let's say sometime beginning of 2022, to around 5%. So it's been a huge hike in the Fed's fund rate over 1 year. It's kind of unprecedented that such a hike has happened. Now, this has caused a double problem, a double whammy, as they're calling it, for the Silicon Valley Bank. So one thing is, because the money supply has tightened, in the previous era where you like quantitative easing and like zero Fed funds rate post the pandemic, that led to a huge like easy money sloshing into these tech companies and all kinds of VC funded companies and cryptocurrencies. Lots of things got funded. There was a huge bubble, and so you had these huge number of tech companies having massive amounts of funding, and they were banking with the Silicon Valley Bank, right? So there were huge deposits with the Silicon Valley Bank, and the Silicon Valley Bank then took those deposits and put them in US treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, right? Similarly, a fairly safe thing to do. Now, but the problem is that this bank is not like a regular bank. Like regular customers, like regular people don't bank with them, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is like almost exclusively, or the deposits, the percentage of deposits are almost exclusively with these startups, right? So they have the size of each deposit is huge, way
Okay.
above the $250,000 limit, which is insured by the FDIC, right? So FDIC guarantees that below that limit, the FDIC will pay the depositors if the bank goes bust. But here, because you had these VC funded startups keeping their money, they all had much in excess of that amount. Now, what happened was once the Federal Reserve started tightening money supply, uh, these startups, a lot of them very speculative, a lot of them not making any profits, and burning through their cash, these startups stopped getting funded,
Okay.
and they stopped getting the additional rounds of funding. So what you had was the customer base of this bank was not depositing new money because they were
Okay.
themselves not getting new money, right? While
Right.
they were withdrawing money to fund their businesses. And this was going on over the last 1 year, right? So you had a bank whose deposits were dropping very rapidly, and the other side of the problem was because they had held their uh, investments in treasury bonds. The treasury bonds started dropping in value because the yields and the value of the bond are
Naturally.
inversely related,
Yes.
right? So as the yields were going down, they were dropping in value. Now the interesting thing is the regulation is such that if you don't sell the bond,
Mm-hmm.
you buy a bond but don't sell it, you hold it to maturity, then you don't need to recognize the loss for the bank, right? But if you sell it, then you have to recognize that as a loss. So now what happened was, because their customers were withdrawing funds, because the customers were not getting funded, they were withdrawing funds. This bank had built up $91 billion in these US treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which they were forced to sell. Now, the moment they sold about $21 billion of that. They recognized a $1.8 billion loss,
Mm-hmm.
which is a fairly big loss. And then they announced that uh, they are going to compensate that by doing a new round of fundraising for $2.5 billion or $2.25 billion, and they announced this last Wednesday. And that kind of rattled their depositors. And apparently some of these big VC funds, including like funds like Peter Thiel's fund, they asked their portfolio companies to withdraw money from the bank. And in a single day, on Thursday, $42 billion were withdrawn from that bank, which caused a bank run, right? I mean, which basically triggered a bank run. The bank ran out of funds to give to their depositors, and it collapsed. And that basically, then what had happened was the rest of the customers were not able to withdraw their money. And then you had this panic situation where you had, like, they apparently have more than 37,000 startups banking with them. So these companies were frozen out. And then you had this huge worry that the US startup scene would effectively suddenly collapse because of this. And now we are hearing, like today, the Federal Reserve and Treasury have moved in, and they are going to uh, basically ensure
Take
that everybody,
decisive action. That's what they're saying.
they're basically bailing out the banks yet again, right? I mean, this is
Right.
like the repeat of 2008. They are going to they're basically saying that uh, anybody who has deposited cash even in excess of 250,000, they are going to, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are going to make sure uh, uh, that they get their money back. And then they have announced some more schemes that other banks in similar conditions, they would be able to pledge their treasury bonds with the US Fed, and in return they will be able to take loans. And when they pledge, it will not be pledged at the market value, but
Mm-hmm.
at the coupon value. So if let's say you buy a bond at $100 and the bond goes to $90, then you pledge it not at $90, you would pledge it $100, which is kind of a implicit uh,
A bailout.
yeah, you're basically giving free money to the banks, right? And so the very interesting, like what was amusing in all this, and kind of sad in all this, was that you had, when this panic happened, you had all these big VCs who kind of talk so much about deregulations and like how free market and free enterprise is going to unleash their creativity, they were all screaming for bailouts, right? So it's
And we've
fine.
seen that happen before as well, Bappa.
Yeah. So I mean, this is how the system works, where um, so it's market discipline for the poor, while it's government funded subsidies for the rich, and we are seeing that getting repeated all over again.
Right, Bappa. Thanks very much for joining us. Thousands remembered Hugo Chavez last Sunday, which marked 10 years of the passing of the former president of Venezuela. People in Caracas stepped out with placards in his memory and how he transformed Venezuelan society and politics. Prasant from People's Dispatch was there when it all happened on 5th March, and he's here to talk about why Venezuela and the world remember Chavez. So, Prashant, good to have you back with us. Prashant, you were actually there on 5th March. Can you tell us what that was like? What were the aspects of Hugo Chavez's memory which people were remembering the most?
Right. So it was a very emotional moment for Venezuelans, as you can guess, because it's been 10 years of the passing of Chavez. And, the predominant sentiment, both in the seminars and panels that were taking place, which were attended by leaders across Latin America, and on the mobilizations on the street, was that he's still alive in many senses.
Okay.
And the fact that his legacy continues through the Bolivarian Revolution, which has stayed in power and which has continued over the past 10 years. So that was really the fundamental theme of the whole commemoration, the whole 10 years, and that is reflected, like I said, both by the leaders who spoke and the militants and the activists on the ground. The fact that, despite all the challenges that Venezuela has undergone, we'll talk about it in the past 10 years, despite despite the financial sanctions, despite all kinds of obstructions, despite internal coup attempts, assassination attempts, Chavez's legacy has really sort of been strengthened, in fact, by the fact that there is large-scale participation in the process of governance itself, that they have actually extended a lot of the programs Chavez had visualized, and that it's not been just a welfareish perspective where the government gives some benefits to the poor people, but a process of actually planning whereby from the lowest levels people participate in the question of how resources should be allocated, and then there is distribution. So there are multiple levels of governance, including levels of governance where people, the common people, actually form the core constituent part of it, and they're actually involved in the planning. So it's not just a top-down, we will give you such and such approach, but actually a merging of both the executive and the government on the one hand, and the people's power on the other. And that is one of the key aspects of Chavez's legacy, and also the question of what is called the civic military partnership. The fact that unlike in many countries where the military has been a right-wing force, the military in Venezuela has become an integral part of the Bolivarian Revolution, working very strongly in combination with the civilian forces, with a progressive perspective on society, which is really quite an interesting thing as well. And the fact that, whether it be women, whether it be the indigenous sections, there's been an empowering of a lot of marginalized communities, a lot of marginalized sections as well, a lot of focus on the youth to bring them into the role and bring them as protagonists of this revolutionary process. So all of this together, so it was a moment of stock taking, it was a moment of reflection, it was a moment of resistance and defiance, but it was also a moment of thinking ahead about how to deepen some of these processes, and how to sort of face the challenges. For instance, there were a lot of discussions on how to improve what are called the productive forces, how to ensure there is better production so that Venezuela moves out of its oil-centric economy, which has been identified as one of the key challenges facing the government. So there's more production of food, there are more production of other resources. That's a key question. There's also the question of how to further deepen this democracy involving the people, so that as time passes, there's a unity in facing the challenges that are coming from abroad. So all in all, quite interesting. And like I said, multiple parallels. It was not just series of seminars where leaders came and spoke. There were it was something where people felt very involved in the question of Chavez's legacy, from the slogans that people raised, from the emotions that were clearly on display. It was not one of those government ceremonies marking the anniversary of passing where people just put some flowers and say some token words. It was a very different commemoration, and I think that the thousands of people who mobilized on the streets were actually a very good evidence of the fact that Chavez and his project are still very central to Venezuela, and the fact that Nicolas Maduro, the fact that he's continued that trajectory is something that people really recognize, people stand by. So there was a lot of support for the current government as well in its continuation of that legacy.
Right, Prashant. Prashant, can you also just talk about the challenges in a little more detail? What are they? How is Venezuela planning to counter them?
Right. So we need to understand that this is a long process. The fact that, from the Obama era onwards in the United States, there's been an attack on Venezuela in terms of really restricting its attempt to sort of survive, or containing it, and trying to really squeeze it as much as possible. And that's clearly because the fact that in the sense that I think some of the people that spoke about it is natural that the United States and its allies would do that, because Venezuela, in some senses, presents a model which is threatening, to the US and its allies, not militarily or anything, because
Right.
obviously Venezuela is such a small country, but the fact that its development model, its model of people's participation, its model of how democracy is envisioned, all of these are actually quite dangerous as far as the US is concerned. And there was no greater example than Chavez, who, for instance, leveraged the oil resources he had to, on the one hand, like I said, spend massively on improving people's education, people's healthcare, and on democracy, because it requires both financial and political investment, and also on regional integration, which is really another cornerstone of Chavez's project. The fact that he established institutions which enabled the countries of the region to actually come together and present an alternative to the United States. And that was what was called the famous pink tide
Right.
of the early 2000s. There was Ecuador, there was Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, many of these countries, not all of them on the same political plane, of course. All of them had slight variations in how they understood their politics, but they all came together in this project of integration because they understood the benefits of cooperating and the benefits of not allowing the US to exercise hegemony over the region, because all these countries had experience of what the United States' support to military dictatorships in the previous decade had led to. So these two were really the cornerstones of Chavez's approach, and both of these were deeply threatening to the US and its allies. So it's no surprise that there was this consistent attempts over years, over US administrations, to impose a huge number, hundreds of sanctions on
Right.
entities, on banks, everywhere. And that really sort of caused a huge threat to life in Venezuela. We have reports of 40,000 deaths taking place due to sanctions. And there was also an attempt to support, which continues to support this coup administration of Juan Guaido and the
Right.
National Assembly. They continue to call Nicolas Maduro a disputed president, although
Right.
that clearly does not seem to be the sentiment on the street. So those challenges still very much there, but two aspects, like I said, the fact that the Bolivarian revolution has survived is an important aspect. The second, the fact that the regional dynamics is also changing now, more progressive governments coming to power, is also reflecting in Venezuela's stronger position in the region. So the challenge is definitely continuing, but also signs of hope.
Right, Prashant. Thanks a lot for joining us with that. By air, land, sea, and in space, in cyberspace, and through special operations. That's the widespread of the military drills of the United States and South Korea ongoing right now. The militarization has been building up, as we've talked about on the show before, making it a destabilizing situation for the region. Let's go over to Anish from People's Dispatch about what's going on and the implications. Anish, good to have you back on the show. So, we begin Monday's show by talking about what we've said often. There's too much buildup of militarization in that region. What is the United States trying to prove? Why is South Korea playing along? Can you just tell us what's happening?
I mean, this is pretty much going on the expected lines. If you look at the trajectory of the decision that has been happening ever since you took over the presidency in South Korea, what we're seeing is, and from the statements and reports that we see all over the place, the U.S. and South Korea is basically trying to do what they are calling as war preparations, and this sort of war preparation is basically if you're preparing for war, you're essentially not looking for peace at this point, and you're not looking for tensions to go down, or to find any kind of resolution that can actually be sustainable in the foreseeable future. But this is happening. It is one of the biggest military drills right now in years now. We haven't seen it ever since Moon Jae-in was the president, the former president. And so this level of military drills going on for 11 days is definitely going to put tensions on a very, on a very high tempo for the next few days, for at least this week. We have already seen missile launches from North Korea and that is also not good because this pretty much just adds to the tension. But in both cases, we're seeing this sort of war preparation, and it's pretty much again part of this whole Asia Pacific or Pacific strategy that the United States is employing right now, and it's not just targeted to North Korea, but also against China. We're seeing that with recent, we will be seeing that in the recent AUK's announcements on the nuclear submarine that they will be making later in the day. So this is pretty much like part of this whole program to pretty much escalate tensions in the region entirely.
Anish, you've said this before, this is not a region known for wars in its recent history. Is there a way that you can see where people might actually step back from these tensions?
It's going to be very difficult because we're literally seeing nothing on the horizon. We're not seeing any level of initiative either from the north or the south or from the United States. Definitely not from the United States to actually call for talks. Forget about peace or a resolution or anything else. But it's just like basic talks or negotiations are right now off the table. It just does is not happening. It is not going to happen in the coming days. We are not seeing any kind of moves in that direction, and that is the worst part of it, because we have seen how much progress that was made during the peace talks between 2018 and 2020 before Trump put a spanner into it. And we saw the kind of progress that could be made. We saw a unified Olympics team. We saw, a statement calling for an eventual end to the Korean War. Uh, all of this could have been possible. It's just that there was this one other party that was not interested in it, which whose only interest in the region is the fact that they hold a massive military deployment in the region, and it just is going to make even worse. We are seeing already now you have lower level politicians calling for South Korea to start arming itself with nuclear weapons, and this is going to become a very common rhetoric now in the coming days, because you have the a very a very battered conservative party, battered in the sense that its popularity is low. It is not doing very well in its domestic front, so it is definitely being put in the corner over a whole host of issues, and it is now using this sort of war mongering or war hawkish kind of language to try to salvage its popularity by whatever means possible, and the US is playing along with it. And this is going to keep rolling because we're seeing nothing happening even that can actually elevate that situation either. So these factors, multiple factors, are now pushing things to an edge. We are still not in a situation where conflict is possible, but definitely tensions are very high in at least more than a decade now. So even if you look at the larger history, like, or even just recent history of how things have escalated or spiraled actually. Ever since 2022, when Moon Jae-in lost the election, we've seen this rhetoric of being strong, being giving it back to the North Koreans or the communist regime there, uh, becoming quite mainstream, and it's not new. It has happened before. We have seen that sort of tensions happening in 2000s, especially when the nuclear weapon launches and tests were quite common in North Korea, and we only saw just one part of that in the mainstream media. But on the other side, there was tensions being built up. There was hawkish behavior from South Korean politicians as well, and the same thing is happening right now. So on the domestic front, you already have these sort of provocations happening. Very recently, last year, South Korea actually opened up, all the sort of restrictions that were put on, putting propaganda across the border. Now that has always been the sort of, issues that North Korea raised during the peace talks, which was basically that you had these sort of provocative propaganda being airdropped by conservative groups and defectors, and that often actually played, and because it is happening across a demilitarized border, and that is always going to not going to have any kind of great impact unless you want to increase tensions. But this is now being allowed under the UN administration. The UN administration is also going for is kind of focusing right now on North Korea far too much with the kind of talks that they are making. They even created a new deal for Japan so that its relations with Japan does not become strained. We saw the deal being for war crimes and for forced labor, compensation for forced labor, being decried by the victims of those forced labor and their families. And despite that, the South Korean administration went ahead with it. So you're seeing these sort of multiple levels of compromises and also provocative acts being made just so that South Korea can, surround itself with more hawkish neighbors on the military front, make relations with them that will again create more provocations from North Korea itself. So these tensions you have to see on a larger scale. It's like a region-wide tension because Korea has always been that sort of one flashpoint for tensions, if not for conflict, since the 50s. And that flashpoint is now becoming quite, problematic at this point where, talking about, expecting talks or negotiations or even peace is a distant matter right now. And that's how things have spiraled to. And it's a sad development in this year at least.
And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow. And for more stories like these, visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and our social media profiles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.